The man who walked with humility. The sun was setting on Rodeo Drive, casting a golden glow that shimmered on the sleek glass windows of luxury boutiques. The street, known for its opulence and exclusivity, was alive with the soft hum of expensive engines and the rhythmic clack of designer heels against polished sidewalks. Among the well-dressed shoppers and high-society elites, a man strolled with quiet confidence. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, and well-worn sneakers, Keanu Reeves moved without pretense. His hair, slightly tousled by the evening breeze, framed a face that held warmth, depth, and a quiet humility that made him different from the crowd that flocked to these high-end stores. Keanu wasn't here to flaunt wealth or chase attention. His purpose was personal. As he walked, he caught sight of something in the display window of an upscale fashion boutique, an elegant wristwatch, sleek and timeless. The way it caught the light, shimmering like a miniature galaxy, made him smile. It was perfect. He had been searching for a special gift, and this was it. With an easy stride, he reached for the boutique's door handle. It was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting his own unassuming image back at him. But just as he pushed the door open, a voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir," said a young man in a perfectly tailored suit, his tone polite yet laced with something else. Judgment. Keanu turned to face him, his signature warm smile unwavering. Yes. The store attendant, standing with impeccable posture, gave him a once-over. His sharp, scrutinizing gaze flicked over Keanu's casual clothing, his eyes lingering on the faded denim and simple sneakers. There was something in his expression, perhaps amusement, perhaps disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" the young man asked, adjusting the golden cufflinks on his pristine white shirt. Keanu arched a brow, his smile never faltering. "I think so," he replied, nodding toward the watch display. "I'm here to buy a gift." The employee hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. For a moment, he seemed to consider whether to let Keanu inside. The hesitation was subtle but unmistakable, and the air between them thickened with an unspoken assumption. Someone dressed like that couldn't possibly afford what was inside. Keanu, however, remained patient. He had encountered people like this before, those who measured a man's worth by the cut of his suit or the brand of his shoes. It didn't faze him. He had long since learned that true worth had nothing to do with appearances. The employee finally stepped aside, though his forced smile barely concealed his skepticism. "Very well, sir," he said, holding the door open with an exaggerated flourish. "Welcome to Prestige Timepieces." Inside, the boutique exuded sophistication. Sleek glass cases held rows of watches, each more exquisite than the last. Soft classical music played in the background, and the scent of expensive cologne lingered in the air. A handful of well-dressed customers milled about, their designer handbags and tailored suits marking them as members of an exclusive club, one where appearances mattered. Keanu walked in, his eyes scanning the collection. He knew exactly which watch he wanted. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman in a fitted blazer and pearl earrings looked up from a catalog. Her eyes locked onto Keanu, and for a split second, she mirrored the same hesitation as the young employee at the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but cool. Keanu nodded, stepping closer to the display case. "Yes, that one," he said, pointing at the timepiece he had spotted from outside. The woman's brows lifted slightly. "That's the Eclipse Chronomaster, a limited edition. Only 50 were made worldwide," she said, watching him carefully. "It's quite an expensive piece." Keanu simply nodded. "It's perfect." A short silence hung between them before she continued. "Would you like to see a different collection? Perhaps something more affordable?" There it was. The assumption. The young employee who had greeted him at the door smirked slightly, exchanging a glance with another staff member behind the counter. Keanu noticed, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he kept his expression relaxed. "No, thank you," he said kindly. "I'd like to see that one." The woman hesitated for a second longer before finally reaching into the glass case. She carefully lifted the watch and placed it on a black velvet tray. Keanu picked it up, examining its craftsmanship with appreciation. The weight, the detail, it was exactly what he was looking for. "I'll take it," he said simply. Another pause. This time, it was more pronounced. The woman's lips parted slightly in surprise, and the young man behind her let out the faintest scoff, as if expecting Keanu to backpedal when he heard the price. "Sir," the woman said carefully, "this piece costs $235,000. Keanu set the watch back onto the velvet with the utmost care, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a sleek black card and placed it on the counter. "Will this be fine?" he asked. The woman's face froze. The young employee, now visibly flustered, took a step closer, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. A hush fell over the boutique. Nearby, a couple who had been admiring a different display turned to watch. A man in a navy suit glanced up from his own purchase. The boutique staff exchanged glances, realization dawning on them far too late. Keanu Reeves. The name carried weight, not just as a Hollywood icon, but as a man known for his kindness, humility, and quiet generosity. A man who had never been one to flaunt wealth or status. The woman behind the counter blinked rapidly, then quickly straightened. "Of course, sir," she said, her professional mask slipping back into place, but there was a new nervousness in her voice. The young employee's smirk had vanished. He now stood stiffly, his hands clasped behind his back, his confidence from earlier evaporating into awkward silence. As the transaction was processed, Keanu remained polite, offering a small smile as he watched the woman place the watch into a finely crafted box. "You didn't need to assume," he said gently, looking up at her. "People don't always dress the way you expect." The woman swallowed, nodding quickly. "You're absolutely right, sir. I apologize for any misunderstanding." Keanu simply nodded, taking the package with an easy grace. Then, before turning to leave, he looked at the young employee who had stopped him at the door. "Thank you for holding the door for me," he said with a knowing smile. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the boutique staff standing in stunned silence. They had judged a man by his clothing. They had assumed, and they had been wrong. And now, they regretted everything. A lesson in worth. Keanu Reeves stepped out of the boutique, the sleek black shopping bag in hand, his expression as calm as ever. The sun had dipped lower into the horizon, painting the sky in rich hues of amber and violet. The soft hum of the city surrounded him, the distant chatter of evening shoppers, the occasional honk of a car, the rhythmic footsteps of people who hurried past, wrapped in their own worlds. But inside prestige timepieces, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The store's staff stood frozen in awkward silence, the weight of their mistake pressing upon them like an unspoken truth. The middle-aged woman behind the counter, still clutching the receipt, released a slow breath as realization settled deep into her chest. The young employee, the one who had greeted Keanu at the door with barely concealed arrogance, now stood rigid, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. His perfectly tailored suit, once a symbol of confidence and control, now felt suffocating. His mind replayed the moment over and over, the way he had sized up the man in casual clothing, the way he had almost denied him entry, the way he had assumed Keanu didn't belong. And yet, he had belonged more than anyone else in that room. Keanu hadn't demanded recognition. He hadn't lashed out, hadn't humiliated them the way they had tried to humiliate him. Instead, he had taught them a lesson without a single harsh word. That was Keanu Reeves, the woman behind the counter finally whispered, more to herself than to anyone in particular. "Yes, the Keanu Reeves," another employee mumbled, his voice laced with guilt. A low murmur rippled through the boutique. Customers who had witnessed the exchange whispered amongst themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others glancing at the now flustered staff with mild amusement. The young employee clenched his jaw, his stomach twisting uncomfortably. He had spent years perfecting the art of reading people, knowing who to prioritize, who to cater to, and who to dismiss. It was an unspoken rule in high-end retail. Appearances mattered. But today, that rule had betrayed him. He had judged the wrong man. And now he felt the weight of his own arrogance crashing down on him. The store manager, a refined man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and an air of authority, stepped forward. He had been in his office when the incident occurred, but the whispers had reached him quickly. He glanced around the store, noting the tension in the air, and then settled his gaze on his staff. "Who stopped him at the door?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. The young employee stiffened but didn't respond immediately. The manager's sharp eyes flicked to him. "Was it you, Richard?" Richard swallowed hard and nodded slowly. "I." He hesitated, searching for words that might lessen the sting of his mistake, but there were none. The manager exhaled through his nose, his disappointment evident. "Do you realize what you've done?" Richard nodded again, this time with genuine remorse. "I made an assumption," he admitted. The manager scoffed. "A poor one." He turned toward the woman at the counter. "And you? You questioned his ability to afford the watch, didn't you?" She flinched but nodded. I didn't mean to offend him," she murmured. The manager shook his head. "Intent doesn't matter. Perception does. And the perception we just gave to every customer in this store is that we judge people based on their appearance. That is unacceptable." The staff remained silent, shame thick in the air. The manager crossed his arms. "Do you know why Keanu Reeves is so respected?" No one answered. "Because he is the kind of man who has nothing to prove. He doesn't flaunt his wealth. He doesn't seek validation. And yet, he gives more to people than any of the so-called elites we cater to daily. That man has donated millions to charity, helped crew members from his own paychecks, and sits with homeless people just to hear their stories. And we just treated him like he didn't belong." Richard's face burned. He had always prided himself on knowing how to handle high-profile clients, how to impress, how to persuade. But today, he had failed before he had even spoken his first full sentence to the customer. "Apologies won't undo what's been done," the manager continued. "But they can be a start." Richard didn't need to be told twice. Outside, Keanu continued walking down Rodeo Drive, his steps unhurried. He wasn't angry. He had dealt with situations like this before, being underestimated, being misjudged, being seen as less because he didn't parade his wealth like others. But that had never been who he was. Wealth had never defined him. Money had never been his motivation. As he strolled past another boutique, he caught sight of a woman sitting on a bench, her back hunched, her clothes worn and mismatched. She was rummaging through a small bag, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. A street vendor nearby looked at her with sympathy, shaking his head as he realized she didn't have enough to buy a meal. Keanu stopped. Without hesitation, he approached the vendor. "Give her whatever she wants," he said softly, handing over a bill far larger than necessary. The vendor's eyes widened. "Sir, this is..." Keanu shook his head with a gentle smile. "Just make sure she eats." The woman, having heard the exchange, looked up in surprise. She opened her mouth to speak, but Keanu simply nodded, his warm gaze meeting hers for a brief moment before he turned to leave. Behind him, the woman clutched her meal as if it were the greatest gift she had ever received. The luxury store had failed to recognize the value of the man who had walked through their doors. But this woman, she saw him for what he truly was. And as Keanu walked away, he felt the kind of peace that money could never buy. Back at Prestige Timepieces, Richard stepped out of the boutique, scanning the street for any sign of Keanu. His heart pounded with nervous energy. He spotted him, further down the sidewalk, moving with quiet grace. Richard hesitated for only a second before quickening his pace. "Mr. Reeves," he called, breathless as he reached him. Keanu turned, his expression calm, his eyes filled with curiosity. Richard swallowed hard. I just wanted to apologize, he said, his voice sincere. For how I treated you, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Keanu studied him for a moment, then offered a small, knowing smile. People make mistakes, he said simply, but the real test is whether they learn from them. Richard exhaled, the tightness in his chest easing slightly. I will, he promised. Keanu nodded, then patted him on the shoulder before continuing on his way. As Richard watched him disappear into the city, he knew one thing for certain. Today, he had met a man who wasn't defined by wealth, power, or fame. He had met a man defined by character, and he would never make the same mistake again. The weight of perception. Richard stood in place, watching Keanu Reeves disappear into the sea of people, his heart still racing from the interaction. The moment felt surreal. He had just apologized to one of the most respected figures in Hollywood, and instead of receiving anger or a cold dismissal, he had been met with understanding. That alone shook him to his core. He turned back toward prestige timepieces, his mind a battlefield of regret and reflection. How many times had he judged customers before? How many people had he dismissed just because they didn't fit the expected mold of wealth? The thought unsettled him. As he stepped back into the boutique, the silence that had blanketed the staff after Keanu left still lingered. The manager was speaking in hushed tones to the woman at the counter, their faces marked with unease. Other employees exchanged nervous glances, their usual confidence dulled by the weight of what had just transpired. Richard exhaled deeply and walked toward his manager. I spoke to him, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. The manager lifted an eyebrow. And he forgave me, Richard said, still processing it himself. He didn't have to, but he did. The woman behind the counter let out a soft breath of relief, but the guilt in her eyes remained. We were so quick to judge him, she murmured. She hesitated. I think this job has made me cynical. We see so many people who only care about brands, who flaunt wealth for the sake of appearances. I forgot that real wealth doesn't always need to be seen. The manager studied her, then Richard, before nodding slowly. A hard lesson to learn, but an important one. Before anyone could respond, the glass door of the boutique swung open. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit strode in, exuding an air of arrogance. His slicked back hair was styled to perfection, his wrist adorned with a gleaming watch that likely cost more than a car. He barely acknowledged the other customers in the store as he walked straight to the counter. Richard recognized him instantly. Harrison Vale, a well-known venture capitalist who made a habit of treating people as disposable. He was the kind of customer who expected immediate service, whose presence demanded attention, not because of charm or kindness, but because of sheer entitlement. Finally, Harrison muttered, adjusting his cufflinks as he reached the counter. I need a new watch, something exclusive. Show me your best collection. The woman behind the counter hesitated, still shaken from the previous encounter. She cast a glance at the manager, who gave a small nod, silently instructing her to proceed. Of course, Mr. Vale, she said, her voice measured as she unlocked the case. Harrison barely looked at her. His eyes swept over the watches, unimpressed. Tacky, he said, dismissing one. Too common, he said about another. Finally, he picked up a sleek platinum timepiece encrusted with diamonds. This will do, he announced, as if it were a mere afterthought. Richard observed the scene with new eyes. Just minutes ago, they had treated Keanu Reeves like an outsider. And now, here was Harrison Vale, someone who dressed the part of wealth, but lacked any of the humility that should have come with it. It was almost poetic. The woman at the counter named the price, $325,000. Harrison didn't even blink. He pulled out his card and handed it over without a second thought. Charge it. I don't have all day. The transaction processed smoothly, but the weight of comparison hung in the air. A man with true wealth had walked into this store, and they had treated him like a nobody. Now, a man with wealth, But no character had walked in, and they had catered to him without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on Richard. Harrison took his watch, barely glancing at the staff before striding out the door as carelessly as he had entered. The boutique returned to a tense silence. The manager let out a quiet sigh, then turned to his employees. "Let this be a lesson to all of us," he said, his tone even but firm. "Not all wealth is worn, and not all rich men are worthy of respect." Meanwhile, Keanu continued his quiet stroll through the city, lost in thought. The encounter at the boutique had not surprised him. He had long accepted that many people judged based on appearances. He had seen it in Hollywood, in high society, in places where status was currency. But he had also seen the opposite: the kindness of strangers, the generosity of those who had little, the warmth of those who saw past material things. As he walked, his phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. "Your dinner reservation is confirmed. Also, the shelter director wanted to thank you again for your donation." Keanu smiled to himself. Few people knew just how much he gave away. He never announced it, never sought recognition for it, but helping others, that was what mattered. He had once lost everything: his best friend, his child, his love. He knew what it felt like to be broken, to have nothing but the kindness of strangers to rely on. It had shaped him into the man he was today, a man who did not need to prove his worth to anyone. He glanced down at the boutique bag in his hand. The watch wasn't for himself. It was a gift for an old friend, someone who had been there for him during his hardest times. Because to Keanu Reeves, true value was never measured in money. It was measured in people. Hours later, as the boutique was closing for the night, Richard found himself still thinking about Keanu Reeves. He thought about how effortlessly the man had carried himself, how he hadn't reacted with anger or indignation. Instead, he had taught them all something invaluable. Richard walked over to the glass display, looking at the watches with a different perspective now. Not as symbols of status, but as objects, mere possessions. For the first time, he asked himself, what truly makes a man valuable? And for the first time, he understood the true measure of a man. The night had settled over Los Angeles, casting a soft, bluish glow over Rodeo Drive. The once bustling street had quieted, save for the occasional laughter of late-night diners and the hum of engines from luxury cars gliding past. Storefronts dimmed their lights, signaling the end of another day catering to the elite. Inside prestige timepieces, the boutique was finally closing. Richard lingered near the counter, staring absently at the gleaming glass display. The watches sat untouched, their worth measured in zeros, their desirability dictated by names engraved on their faces. Yet, for the first time in his career, he saw them differently. Luxury had always been his world. The exclusivity, the power that came with it, it had been intoxicating. He had built a persona around understanding wealth, catering to those who lived in excess. But today that world had cracked. Keanu Reeves had shattered it without even trying. The man had walked in, quiet and unassuming, and had been underestimated in an instant. Richard had judged him, dismissed him, and assumed he wasn't worthy of their time. And yet Keanu had walked out the richest man Richard had ever met. Not because of money, but because of the way he carried himself. Richard exhaled sharply, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. He felt a tap on his shoulder, and he turned to see Sophie, the woman who had served Keanu at the counter, standing beside him. Her eyes held the same haunted realization that had been gnawing at him all night. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded. He didn't need to ask what it was. Sophie leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "You know, I've been in retail for 10 years. I thought I knew people. I thought I could read them in seconds. And I was so sure he wasn't someone who could afford anything in this store." She shook her head at herself, biting her lip. "I feel like an idiot." Richard didn't respond right away. He was still processing it all himself. Instead, he simply said, he wasn't mad. Sophie turned her gaze to him. I know. That's what makes it worse. He could have made a scene. He could have embarrassed us. But he didn't. Richard let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. Instead, he taught us a lesson. Sophie sighed, rubbing her arms as if shaking off the guilt weighing her down. I wonder how many people I've treated that way before. People who didn't look rich enough, didn't fit the right image. Richard frowned, more than we'd like to admit. A brief silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft clicking of the boutique manager locking up the doors. The lesson lingered in the air, a silent reckoning neither of them could shake. Then, the door rattled. Someone was outside. Sophie and Richard turned toward the glass entrance. A man stood there, his frame hunched, his clothes worn and slightly dirty. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his shoulders curled inward in a way that suggested he was used to being ignored. Richard's gut twisted. Before today, he wouldn't have thought twice. He would have assumed, just as he had with Keanu, that the man didn't belong, that he wasn't worth their attention. But tonight, after everything that had happened, Richard saw things differently. The manager, however, wasn't on the same page. He sighed impatiently and gestured for them to ignore it. Probably just a homeless guy looking for change, he muttered. We're closed. Sophie hesitated. Then, before Richard could think twice, she moved forward and unlocked the door. The man outside flinched slightly as the door swung open. His eyes, deep-set and tired, flicked between them warily. He was used to being turned away. Can I help you? Sophie asked gently. The man hesitated, shifting from foot to foot. I don't want to bother you, he said, his voice hoarse. He swallowed hard, then gestured toward the watch displays inside. I was just looking. Richard felt his chest tighten. The man wasn't asking for money. He wasn't begging. He was simply looking. Something about that hit Richard harder than he expected. The boutique manager sighed, clearly impatient. Sir, we're closing. But before he could finish, Richard spoke. Come in. Sophie glanced at him in surprise, but she didn't object. The man's brows lifted slightly, as if he hadn't expected to be welcomed inside. Really? He asked. Richard nodded. Yeah, come in. The man stepped inside cautiously, as if expecting to be thrown out any second. His eyes darted over the gleaming watches, his expression one of quiet awe. Sophie smiled warmly. See something you like? The man chuckled, a sound laced with disbelief. I could never afford any of this. Richard's lips pressed together. That was the thing, wasn't it? People were always defined by what they could afford, by what they wore, by what their wallets said about them. But tonight, Richard saw things differently. Doesn't mean you can't appreciate them, Richard said. The man looked at him, studying him as if trying to determine whether he was being mocked. When he saw nothing but sincerity, something in his posture eased. For the next few minutes, they simply talked. Richard showed him some of the watches, explaining details, the craftsmanship, the history behind certain collections. The man listened intently, nodding along, asking thoughtful questions. It was the most human interaction Richard had had all day. No wealth, no status games, no judgments, just people. Finally, after a while, the man smiled and took a step back. Thank you, he said quietly, for not treating me like I don't belong. Richard felt something shift inside him. You do belong, he said simply. The man nodded once, then turned and left, disappearing into the night. Sophie exhaled, staring after him. I think we just did something good, she murmured. Richard smirked slightly. Feels better than selling a watch to Harrison Vale. Sophie laughed, shaking her head. As they finished closing up for the night, Richard realized something profound. Keanu Reeves had changed them. He hadn't lectured them. He hadn't scolded them. He hadn't humiliated them for their ignorance. He had led by example. And now Richard understood something that he had been blind to for years. A person's worth isn't measured in money. It's measured in how they treat others. As he shut off the boutique lights and locked the door behind him, Richard knew one thing for certain. He would never look at people the same way again. The reflection of a man. The city lights shimmered over Los Angeles as Richard walked down the quiet streets, his mind still replaying the events of the day. The boutique had closed an hour ago, but he had lingered, lost in thought, unsure if he was ready to go home just yet. Tonight had been different. It had changed him. For the first time in years, he saw beyond the glossy world of wealth and luxury, beyond the crisp suits and expensive cologne that had once dictated his perception of value. He had spent years refining the art of reading people, or so he thought. In reality, he had spent years judging them, deciding, within seconds, who deserved attention and who didn't. And then Keanu Reeves had walked through that door. A man who had defied every expectation Richard had set, who had silently challenged everything he thought he knew about success. And now, Richard was left to face an uncomfortable truth. How many people had he dismissed before? How many had he pushed aside without a second thought? The weight of it settled on his chest, pressing deeper with each step. He found himself wandering into a small diner at the edge of town, the kind of place where the scent of coffee lingered in the air, and the booths were worn from years of use. It wasn't like the high-end restaurants his usual clientele frequented, but that was exactly why he chose it. Tonight, he didn't want to be surrounded by wealth. He wanted reality. Sliding into a booth near the window, he glanced around. A few late-night customers sat scattered throughout the diner. An elderly couple quietly sharing a plate of fries, a group of friends laughing softly over milkshakes, a tired waitress wiping down a counter. And then, in the farthest corner, sat a man in a familiar black t-shirt and faded jeans. Richard's breath caught for a moment. Keanu Reeves. Alone. Sipping a cup of coffee, his eyes distant, lost in thought. Richard hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to seem intrusive, but a pull inside him urged him forward. This was a chance. A chance to say something he hadn't been able to say earlier. A chance to acknowledge the impact Keanu had left on him. Summoning his courage, Richard slowly made his way to the actor's booth, clearing his throat lightly to announce his presence. Keanu looked up, his warm brown eyes meeting Richard's with quiet curiosity. "Mind if I sit?" Richard asked. For a brief second, he worried Keanu wouldn't remember him. After all, he was just one of many people who had likely judged the man unfairly throughout his life. But Keanu simply smiled, nodding toward the seat across from him. Of course. Richard slid into the booth, still feeling slightly out of place. He folded his hands together, staring down at the table before finally speaking. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Richard let out a slow breath, collecting his thoughts. "For today. For the way you handled everything at the boutique." He shook his head at himself. "I misjudged you, badly, and I realized tonight that I've been doing that for years." Keanu studied him for a moment, then set his coffee down. "You're not the first," he said simply. "And you won't be the last." Richard frowned. "Doesn't that bother you?" Keanu smiled slightly. "Why would it?" "Because people don't treat you the way you deserve," Richard said, frustration creeping into his voice, though it wasn't directed at Keanu, but at himself. "They see what you're wearing, and they assume. They don't know who you really are." Keanu chuckled softly, shaking his head. "And that's okay." Richard blinked. "How can you say that?" Keanu leaned back in his seat, his gaze thoughtful. "Because I don't need people to know who I am. That's not why I live my life the way I do." Richard furrowed his brow, confused. Keanu continued, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen what happens when people chase approval. I've seen what happens when they let wealth define them. It doesn't bring peace. It doesn't bring happiness. At the end of the day, it's all just noise." He paused, then glanced down at his hands, his expression momentarily distant. "I've lost people, Richard. More than I can count. And not once did it matter how much money I had. Not once did it change the pain. The words hit Richard harder than he expected. Keanu took a slow sip of his coffee before continuing. So no, I don't care if a store clerk underestimates me. I don't care if people don't recognize me. Because I know who I am. And that's enough. Richard sat in silence, absorbing every word. He had spent so many years trying to be somebody, trying to prove himself, trying to fit into a world that demanded status and wealth. And here was a man who had more success than Richard could ever dream of, saying it didn't matter. And for the first time, Richard believed it. You know, Richard said after a long pause, I met someone else tonight, a man who walked by our store. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't anyone important, but I invited him in anyway. Keanu's lips twitched into a knowing smile. And how did that feel? Richard exhaled, leaning back. It felt right. Keanu nodded approvingly. That's the only measure that matters. Richard looked at the actor sitting across from him, a man who had everything yet carried himself as if he had nothing to prove. A man who had quietly changed him in a way he never expected. He smiled to himself, realizing something profound. Keanu hadn't just bought a watch today. He had given Richard something infinitely more valuable. A new way of seeing people, a new way of understanding worth. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was on the right path. He reached for his coffee, lifting the cup slightly in a silent toast. Keanu mirrored the gesture, his eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. No more words were needed. Tonight had spoken for itself. A change of heart, the soft hum of conversation, and the occasional clinking of plates filled the quiet diner as Richard and Keanu sat across from each other, their coffees steaming between them. The conversation had slowed, settling into a comfortable silence, yet Richard could still feel the weight of the words exchanged. For years, he had built his career on perception, on the belief that wealth could be spotted, measured, and categorized. He had judged people by the way they walked, the brands they wore, the confidence in their posture. But tonight, sitting across from Keanu Reeves in a simple booth of an unassuming diner, he realized how deeply flawed that thinking had been. Keanu didn't just challenge that perception. He shattered it. Richard let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. I can't stop thinking about how different things could have gone today, he admitted. If I hadn't assumed. If I had just treated you like any other customer. No, like a person. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his lips quirking into a small smile. And what would that have changed? Richard frowned. Everything. My reaction. My attitude. The way I made you feel when you walked in. Keanu stirred his coffee absently, his expression thoughtful. Maybe, he said. But the fact that you're thinking about it now, that's what really matters. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. I just don't get it. You could have put me in my place. You could have embarrassed me, called me out in front of everyone in that store. But you didn't. Why? Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Because I've learned that real change doesn't come from shame. It comes from understanding. The words settled over Richard like a blanket, warm yet heavy. Look, Keanu continued, his tone calm but firm. I've met people from every walk of life. Billionaires, struggling artists, kids living on the streets. And I can tell you one thing. The wealthiest people aren't always the richest. Richard swallowed hard, his mind flashing back to the way he had catered to Harrison Vale earlier that evening. The man had worn wealth like armor, exuding an air of superiority that made others bend to his will. But had he been wealthy in any way that mattered? No. He had been cold, detached. A man who saw possessions as power, not as gifts to be appreciated. Keanu, on the other hand, dressed simply, walking without the need to be seen, had carried himself with a quiet abundance that no luxury could buy. Richard's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. I think I've spent too much time around the wrong kind of people, he muttered. Keanu chuckled. Happens to the best of us. Richard let out a humorless laugh. I used to think I was good at reading people. Now, I'm not so sure. Keanu shrugged. Maybe you were just reading the wrong things. That truth hit deeper than Richard expected. He had spent years watching for status symbols, the designer labels, the expensive watches, the subtle cues that someone belonged to the world of luxury. But he had never really seen people. Not until today. Can I ask you something? Richard said after a moment. Keanu nodded. Of course. Why were you even at prestige timepieces today? You don't seem like the kind of guy who cares about expensive watches. Keanu smiled, his eyes softening with nostalgia. It wasn't for me. It was a gift. Richard's brows lifted. For who? Keanu's gaze drifted to the window, his expression distant. An old friend. Someone who helped me when I had nothing. Someone who never judged me, never asked for anything in return. I figured it was time I showed him how much I appreciate what he did for me. Richard sat back, absorbing the weight of those words. Keanu Reeves, a man who could buy anything, who had access to everything, had been helped once. The idea shook Richard more than he expected. You had nothing? Richard asked hesitantly. Keanu nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. More times than I can count. Life takes things from you, Richard. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. But you know what I've learned. Richard shook his head. Keanu smiled, but there was something bittersweet in it. You're not defined by what you lose. You're defined by how you keep going. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. This man, this legend, had experienced loss, pain, hardship, and yet he carried himself with the kind of peace that Richard had never seen in even the richest men he had served. For the first time, Richard realized that true wealth wasn't about money at all. It was about character. It was about resilience. It was about kindness, even when the world gave you every reason to be cold. Richard let out a shaky breath. I think I've had a pretty messed up idea of success, he admitted. Keanu chuckled. You and most of the world. Richard smirked, shaking his head. So what? I just unlearned everything overnight. Suddenly stopped caring about status and wealth. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. No, but maybe you start by seeing people before you see their wallets. The words felt simple, but to Richard, they meant everything. For years, he had been blind. But tonight, he had finally opened his eyes. The waitress walked by, refilling their cups, and Richard found himself smiling at her, really seeing her for the first time. She was exhausted, but she still offered them a kind smile. Before she could walk away, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crisp bills, far more than the cost of their coffees. He placed them on the table and slid them toward her. For your kindness, he said simply. The waitress blinked, startled. Oh, Richard smiled. You deserve it. Keanu watched the exchange with quiet approval, his eyes twinkling. As the waitress walked away, her hands trembling with the unexpected tip, Richard turned back to Keanu. Think that's a good start? Keanu lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast. I'd say so. The two men sat there, drinking their coffee, no longer a Hollywood legend and a luxury salesman. Just two people, sharing a moment of understanding. And for the first time in his life, Richard felt truly wealthy. A new perspective. The diner had quieted down, the soft murmur of late-night conversations fading into the background as customers trickled out. The neon glow from the "Open 24 Hours" sign flickered outside, casting a faint red hue across the windows. Keanu and Richard sat across from each other, their coffee cups nearly empty, but neither of them seemed in a rush to leave. There was something oddly comforting about the quiet, the kind of stillness that allowed real conversations to take root. Richard had spent years learning the art of conversation, the right words, the perfect tone, the calculated flattery that could convince a customer to spend thousands in minutes. But tonight's conversation had been different. It wasn't about selling. It was about learning. And Richard had learned more in a single evening than in his entire career. He had come face to face with his own bias, stripped down to the uncomfortable truth that he had spent years dismissing people based on appearance. It had taken one moment, one misjudgment, for his world to unravel. And it had taken one man, Keanu Reeves, to make him realize how blind he had been. He wasn't sure whether to be ashamed or grateful. Maybe both. Keanu leaned back in the booth, his fingers tapping lightly against his cup. "So, what happens next?" he asked, his voice casual but laced with meaning. Richard blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Keanu smirked. "You had a realization tonight. You saw something in yourself that you don't like. So, what are you going to do about it?" Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can't just wake up tomorrow and suddenly be a different person." Keanu shrugged. "No, but you can choose to be better, every day. In small ways." Richard thought about that. He thought about the man who had stood outside Prestige timepieces, peering through the glass, hesitant to even step inside. He thought about Harrison Vale, the wealthy investor who had thrown money around like it meant nothing, but had lacked even a shred of humility. He thought about Keanu himself, a man who had more money than most could dream of, yet carried himself with the quiet grace of someone who had nothing to prove. And finally, he thought about himself, the man he had been, the man he could be. "I think," Richard said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I think I'm done measuring people by their wallets." Keanu nodded approvingly. "Good start." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound so easy." Keanu smirked. "It's not. But it's worth it." Richard fell silent, staring down at the last few drops of coffee in his cup. He had spent years chasing status. Now, for the first time, he was chasing character. And that, he realized, was the real difference between wealth and worth. The next day, morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Prestige timepieces, casting long golden streaks across the polished marble floors. The boutique was quiet in the early hours, the air still carrying the crisp scent of expensive leather and fresh coffee. Richard stood behind the counter, his reflection staring back at him from the glass display. But for the first time in a long time, he saw more than just a salesman. He saw a man who had changed. A small bell chimed as the door swung open. A young woman walked in hesitantly, her clothes simple but well-kept. She clutched a small purse, her fingers fidgeting nervously at the strap. Richard straightened, his trained instincts kicking in. In the past, he might have assumed, might have judged, might have dismissed her entirely. But today, he didn't. Today, he saw her. He smiled warmly. "Good morning. Welcome to Prestige Timepieces. How can I help you?" The woman hesitated for only a second before relaxing, offering a small, grateful smile. "I'm looking for a gift," she said softly. "Something special." Richard nodded. "Of course. Let's find something perfect for you." Sophie, standing at the opposite counter, glanced up in quiet surprise. She had noticed it too. The difference. Richard had changed. And this time, he wasn't just selling watches. He was seeing people. 1 week later, Keanu Reeves walked down Rodeo Drive once more, dressed just as he had been that fateful night. A simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, sneakers that had seen better days. But this time, he wasn't heading to a boutique. He was meeting someone. Outside a small cafe, Richard stood waiting. The former salesman was dressed as sharply as ever, but something was different. His posture was more relaxed, his expression more open. He wasn't carrying the weight of pretense anymore. Keanu approached with a small smile. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Neither did I. But I figured I owed you a coffee." Keanu smirked, stepping up to the counter as Richard ordered for them both. As they sat down, Richard exhaled, running a hand over his face. "You really messed me up, you know that." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Richard leaned forward, smirking. I used to know people, or at least I thought I did. But now, I don't see dollar signs anymore. I see stories. Keanu smiled, lifting his cup in a silent toast. Then I'd say that's the best thing that could have happened to you. Richard mirrored the gesture, clinking his cup against Keanu's. And for the first time in his life, he truly believed it.